Good morning or good afternoon, everyone. And first, I'd like to thank the Morocco Institute for the Global South for inviting me in this online symposium or conference. Mark Ysla from Far Eastern University in Manila, the Philippines. And this time I'm going to share with you some insights about Bandung to ASEAN, the Philippines, regional solidarity, and the West Philippine Sea. So the presentation would be quite simple. So I'll be talking about Bandung Conference as an origin story, and then discuss Philippines as Bandung inheritor. And then we're going to zoom into ASEAN, terror versus substance. And briefly, I will share insights about the ASEAN chairmanship of the Philippines in 2026 and how the Bandung conference is somehow reflected in this chairmanship, and with some concluding remarks. So let me begin with a simple question to frame our discussion. How far can the Bandung spirit still guide ASEAN and the Philippines in particular in dealing with today's maritime disputes in the West Philippine Sea? So this question becomes even more relevant because in 2026, the Philippines will serve as the ASEAN chair following Malaysia's term. So in his arrival statement after the 47th ASEAN summit in Kuala Lumpur, our President Ferdinand Marcos Jr. emphasized that the Philippines will carry forward ASEAN's thrust of unity, inclusivity, and sustainability as the region navigates our future together, quote unquote, under the theme, Navigate Our Future Together. The chairmanship will coincide with the early implementation of ASEAN Community Vision 2045, which focuses on a more resilient, people-centered, and sustainable ASEAN. So here we can ask, what kind of future are we trying to navigate toward what the older traditions like the Bandung Conference can guide that particular journey? So one key idea that I want to put on the table early is this. We can think of Bandung as the origin story of post-colonial solidarity, a formative moment when newly independent as Asian and African states tried to define who they are, what they stood for, and how they wanted to relate to great powers. So the principles they articulated there did not actually disappear. They continue to echo in ASEAN's norms and in the way the Philippines frame its foreign policy today, including the issue of the West Philippine Sea. So that is the basic aim that I want to basically unpack in this presentation. Let me start with a bit of context. So we're in April 1955, in the city of Bandung, Indonesia, 29 Asian and African countries, and most of them newly independent or struggling against colonial rule, come together for what becomes known as the Asian African Conference. So here they meet in the middle of two powerful historical currents. The first one is the decolonization, and many participants are emerging from colonial rule. Independence, new its independence is quite new and fragile and incomplete. And the second one is Cold War, rivalry between the United States and the Soviet Union. In fact, in that particular period, it was actually intensifying, and both are competing for influence in Asia and Africa. So in that context, the Bandung Conference had two core ambitions. Number one, to assert agency, to show that Asian and African states were not just objects of great power politics, but actors with their own voices and interests. And second, to resist being reduced to Cold War pawns, to carve out room for independent positions beyond simply choosing what Washington or Moscow wants. So, from the very beginning, Bandung was both a political meeting and a symbolic moment for people of Asia and Africa. A collective statement that the formerly colonized world had arrived on the stage of international politics. One useful way to understand Bandung is through the idea of diplomacy as theater. Think of it as a play. The city of Bandung becomes the stage, the streets, the venues, flags, and banners carefully arranged. Leaders as performers like Sukarno, Nehru, Chou Enlai, Nasser, and many others. They are performers and each are projecting a particular image of leadership, independence, or moderation. And then we have the people of Bandung, lining the streets, cheering delegations, welcoming guests, are the audience participants, giving life and emotion to the theater and the performance itself. So this theatrical dimension does not mean Bandung was hollow. It means that part of what the conference did was perform solidarity. It showed unity, dignity, and independence to the world. It helped these states see themselves as part of a new Afro-ASEAN or Afro-Asian community. So I want to emphasize this because ASEAN later inherits not only Bandung's principles, but also this performative style of diplomacy. Carefully choreographed summits, family photos, joint communiques that protect or project harmony as well as consensus. And we're going to come back to this theatrical element when we look at the ASEAN statements on the West Philippine Sea. Let's talk about internal cleavages, non-aligned versus the alliances. Now, Bandung is often remembered as the birthplace of non-aligned movement. But the conference itself was not ideologically uniform. We can roughly distinguish three currents. The first one is the radicals, so strongly anti-colonial and deeply suspicious of Western military alliances. And then you have the moderates. These are the parties trying to balance between the East and the West. And you have the conservatives, more clearly aligned with Western security structures. In this context, the Philippines belong to the more conservative group, together with countries like Pakistan, Ceylon, Thailand, and others, due to their close ties with the United States and its membership in SEATO, or the Southeast Asian Treaty Organization. One of the major debates at Bandung revolved around military blocs and collective defense. Should newly independent states join alliance systems such as SEATO or CENTO? Or should they commit to a more robust form of neutralism and non-alignment? The Philippines defended the right of states to enter collective defense arrangements, arguing that in a dangerous world, security guarantees were a legitimate choice. So this tells us something important, that even at this supposed origin story of post-colonial solidarity, there were already deep disagreements about how to relate to great powers. So those divergences between more radical, more cautious, and more conservative positions are patterns that we will later see inside ASEAN when it faces issues like the West Philippine Sea. Another often forgotten dimension of Bandung is its engagement with human rights. We usually imagine third world politics in the 1950s as focused on sovereignty and non-interference, but in Bandung, delegations debated whether and how strongly to reference the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. Some states were wary of human rights language, fearing that it could be used as a tool for external interference, and others, like the Philippines, defended human rights as a universal concern. Here, Carlos P. Romulo plays a pivotal role. He argued that anti-colonial struggles and human rights were complementary, not contradictory. Independence should lead not only to state sovereignty, but also to human dignity, justice, freedom for ordinary people. So this is crucial for my argument because the Philippines emerges from Bandung with a dual identity, a pro-Western security partner embedded in US alliance structures, but also a strong advocate of universal norms and legal principles. And that same pattern, reliance on legal frameworks and rights discourse, reappears in the Philippines' later approach to the West Philippine Sea, particularly in its use of UNCLOS and arbitration. So the most concrete outcome of Bandung was the set of 10 Bandung principles, which distill the shared aspirations of the participants, and we can group them into several clusters. The first one, human rights and the UN Charter, which basically outlines respect for fundamental human rights, recognition of the purposes and principles of the United Nations. Second, we have sovereignty and territorial integrity, respect for sovereignty and territorial integrity of nations, and equality of all races, nations, large and small. The third one is non-interference and non-intervention in internal affairs, and recognition of each nation's right to defend itself individually or collectively. The fourth one is the non-use of force and peaceful settlement, refraining from acts of aggression or the threat of the use of force, settling disputes by peaceful means like negotiation, arbitration, judicial settlement, or other peaceful methods. And the last one is about justice, mutual interests, and obligations. Promotion of mutual interests and cooperations among nations, respect for justice, and international obligations. And there is a clear warning against great power manipulation here. Collective defense arrangements should not be used to serve as special interests of any major power. And here, states should not exert pressure on others to conform to their policies. And these principles form what we might call a Bandung vocabulary, a shared language of sovereignty, equality, rights, and peaceful coexistence that post-colonial states use to articulate their claims. These vocabulary will later be translated into ASEAN's Treaty of Amity and Cooperation and ASEAN Charter, and the informal norms we call the ASEAN Way. It is also quite helpful to note how Bandung was actually seen from the outside. So from the perspective of the West, particularly Western intelligence and policy circles, Bandung was seen largely through the Cold War lens. Analysts tracked which delegations were staunchly anti-communists and which were open to engagement with China and the Soviet Union. And here they also paid close attention to Zhou Enlai's performance, noting that his efforts to appear moderate, conciliatory, and peace-oriented should be observed. And they concluded that despite anti-colonial rhetoric, many Asian and African states remained economically and militarily dependent on Western democracies. So here we have two overlapping narratives. Number one, from the Afro-Asian point of view, Bandung was actually a kind of crowning ceremony of solidarity and independence. And second, from Western strategic vantage points, Bandung was an arena of influence in an ongoing ideological struggle. I want to emphasize this because something similar happens today. First, ASEAN statements on the West Philippine Sea project unity and centrality, but behind them, which is the second idea, is that the member states have quite different calculations about security, economics, and relations with China and the United States. So Bandung already contained this tension between solidarity discourse and strategic dependence, which is a tension that has never fully disappeared. So how do we connect Bandung to ASEAN? One way is to see ASEAN as a regional institutionalization of many Bandung ideas. We can trace several continuities. For example, we have the zone of peace, freedom, and neutrality, which echoes the desire to keep the region free from great power rivalry. Second, we have the Treaty of Amity and Cooperation, which codifies commitments to sovereign equality, non-interference in international affairs, and renunciation of the threat or the use of force. And lastly is the peaceful settlement of disputes. So in practice, ASEAN develops what we call the ASEAN way that characterized by, number one, consensus-based decision-making, that instead of majoritarian voting. Second, quiet diplomacy and closed-door negotiations instead of public confrontation. And lastly, a strong preference for face-saving solutions and incremental progress. These features make sense if we see ASEAN as a Bandung inflected project. It carries forward Bandung's emphasis on sovereignty, non-interference, and peaceful coexistence. It also inherits the performative style of Bandung Conference. For example, you have the summits, the communiques or the joint communiques, and the regional rituals that continually perform unity amongst the 11. So it used to be 10, but now 11 ASEAN member states. So when we look at ASEAN meetings today, we are not just seeing bureaucratic procedures. We are, in fact, witnessing the continuation of a Bandung-style diplomatic theater adopted into a regional organization. Let me now bring you to the Philippines directly into the picture and connect it to the Bandung conference and in the issue of the West Philippine Sea. So at Bandung, the Philippines stood in a more conservative, as I mentioned, conservative pro-Western camp due to its alliance with the United States and its participation in SEATO, or the Southeast Asian Treaty Organization. Yet it also played a leading role in defending universal human rights and self-determination. So this gave the Philippines a profile as both security partner and norm advocate. Fast forward to the contemporary period, in the issue of the West Philippine Sea, the Philippines has taken a very Bandung consistent route in at least one crucial respect. It chose to pursue peaceful settlement through law, bringing a case against China under the UNCLOS. It submitted itself to the jurisdiction of an international tribunal and publicly committed to respect the outcome. In 2016, the arbitral award was given, which largely supported the Philippine position, framed domestically as rules-based victory for a smaller state. This legal strategy resonates strongly with Bandung's principle, the principle of respect for international obligations, peaceful settlement of disputes, equality of states, large and small. And we might say, metaphorically, at Bandung, Romulo fought to embed the Universal Declaration of Human Rights in Afro-Asian diplomacy. And today, in the West Philippine Sea, the Philippines fights to embed UNCLOS as the basis of maritime order. So in both moments, the Philippines leans on universal norms to navigate an equal international system. So given this background, what has ASEAN done with the West Philippine Sea? On paper, the promise of ASEAN solidarity is strong. ASEAN's core principles of sovereignty, non-use of force, peaceful settlement of disputes. ASEAN's documents routinely reaffirm respect for international law and UNCLOS. The rhetoric of ASEAN centrality and unity, which suggests that the bloc will act as a cohesive community when a member state's rights are challenged. So in practice, however, the reality is more complex. Within ASEAN, member states have very different threat perceptions and economic dependency vis-a-vis China. And some see China primarily as a security challenge, others as a vital trade and investment partner. So these differences echoes Bandung's earlier splits between radicals, moderates, and conservatives. And the result is that ASEAN members becomes more cautious, carefully balanced in creating communique, particularly in the issue of South China Sea. They mention self-restraint and respect for UNCLOS, and but rarely explicitly mention or referencing the 2016 arbitral award. So in short, ASEAN sometimes looks like Bandung without the boldness. The Treaty of Unity is still there, summits and communiques, family photos, but the substantive solidarity that Bandung aspired to is often weakened by national interests and great power pressures. So here, there are several ideas, no, reactivating uh, the Bandung spirits. For example, we have the normative reinforcement, from performative to practical solidarity, and lastly, human-centered and rights-based West Philippine Sea engagement. So, lastly, I want to share with you the Philippine ASEAN chairmanship in 2026. Can it be a new Bandung moment? These ideas are not just abstract, and they matter because the Philippines will hold the ASEAN chairmanship in 2026. And as I mentioned in our earlier conversation, President Marcos has already framed the chairmanship around unity, inclusivity, and sustainability under the theme Navigate Our Future Together. So this chairmanship coincides with early implementation of ASEAN Community Vision of 2024. So in that sense, in 2026, can be considered as a mini Bandung moment for the Philippines and for the ASEAN, which is a moment to rearticulate a shared vision of regional order, reaffirm the autonomy and agency of Southeast Asian states amid great power rivalry, and update Bandung's call for solidarity and cooperation to fit today's Indo-Pacific context. So, as part of my last discussion, I'd like to provide you some concluding remarks. So, I already discussed Bandung as a foundation. Bandung is an origin story of post-colonial solidarity, and it gave Asian and African states a language of sovereignty, equality, and human rights. The Philippines as inheritor, the Philippines experience at Bandung combined conservative security alignment with a strong advocacy of universal rights and legal norms. That same pattern is visible today in the Philippines' approach to the West Philippine Sea, where Manila uses international law, especially UNCLOS and the 2016 Arbitral Award, as key tools for defending its rights. The third one is that ASEAN is at the crossroads, and 2026 is an opportunity for us to basically perform unity and centrality. And in the issue of the West Philippine Sea, we will continue to prioritize peaceful settlement and human dignity and protect ASEAN's autonomy in an increasingly contested Indo-Pacific. Bandung, of course, cannot draw maritime boundaries for us, and it cannot by itself resolve the West Philippine Sea dispute, but it can do something important. It gives the Philippines and ASEAN a moral and political vocabulary and a shared memory from which to insist that even in a crowded Indo-Pacific, sovereignty, justice, human dignity, and freedom from coercion remain non-negotiable. So if we treat Bandung not only as a commemorative event, but as a living framework that can be reinterpreted for new challenges, then its spirit still has much to offer to the Philippines, to the region of ASEAN, and to the wider region. Thank you very much, and I look forward to your questions and comments.